Before we begin, if you're listening tonight from somewhere quiet, maybe wrapped in a blanket, or staring up at a dark ceiling, let us know in the comments what time it is and where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're new, here, consider subscribing. We tell the parts of history that most people skip, the slow, the forgotten, the boring details that shaped everything. Now, let's return to a moment that carved more than just stone. Asterisk long before the sound of drills or the echo of dynamite. Long before tourists posed for pictures beneath the granite gaze of presidents. The land called Pahasapa stood still and sacred. These weren't just hills. They were breath. They were memory. And they were alive. The Lakota people didn't carve the Black Hills. They listened to them. To understand Mount Rushmore, you have to forget it first. You have to close your eyes and imagine the same peak without stone faces. No Roosevelt, no Jefferson, no Washington, no Lincoln. Just wind and pine. Elk trails curving through snow. The crunch of early winter on granite slopes. The shadows of birds passing over a ridge shaped like a sleeping woman. The Lakota called it Wamaka Ognaka, Ekin, the heart of everything that is. The land wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a metaphor. It was alive. They didn't go there to admire its view. They went to pray, to mourn, to prepare for birth or death. The Black Hills were a cradle, a burial ground, a cathedral. By the early 18th century, the Lakota had begun migrating into this region displaced from there earlier. Homes near the Great Lakes due to pressure from other tribes and the encroachment of European fur traders. What they found in western South Dakota wasn't just geography, it was prophecy. According to their oral traditions, the Black Hills had always been meant for them. They had returned home, not discovered it. Generations grew up within the folds of those hills, not as settlers, but as part of the terrain. Ceremonies took place in the same groves year after year. Vision quests stretched across the ridges. Sacred sites dotted the hills, places like Bear Butte, where leaders would fast in solitude and seek wisdom from ancestors and spirits. There was no land ownership in the Western sense. No fencing, no mining, no surveying. But then the maps came in 1868. The Fort Laramie Treaty was signed between the United States and the Lakota, then one of the few moments where ink tried to bind power to peace. In it, the U.S. promised that the Black Hills would remain forever Lakota territory. The phrase, "as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall flow," echoed in the mouths of politicians. It would only take 6 years to break it. The discovery of gold by General George Armstrong Custer's 1874 expedition was like blood in water. Prospectors swarmed into the hills. The sacred peaks were no longer places of worship. They were mineral deposits, surveyed, measured, claimed. The Lakota protested, but they resisted. They were ignored. In 1877, the U.S. government seized the Black Hills in direct violation of the treaty. They simply passed a congressional act and took them. No compensation, no apology. The hills became property, not spirit. For the Lakota, it wasn't just land theft. It was soul theft. Imagine watching the place where your ancestors are buried being turned into a mine. Imagine ceremonies disrupted by pickaxes. Imagine being told your memory has no legal weight. By the 1880s, the hills were full of settlers and surveyors. Towns grew along the trails. Timber companies harvested trees from sacred groves. Mineral companies drilled into veins once untouched. The sounds of mourning were replaced by the clang of industry in Lakota's spiritual life. Land is not passive. It listens, it remembers, and perhaps it mourns too. By the time the idea of carving presidents into Mount Rushmore was proposed, the land had already been spiritually desecrated, but not forgotten. The pain was living. It was generational. Many Lakota believed the spirits had retreated deeper into the hills, or gone silent entirely. But there were still children who grew up hearing the songs, still elders who remembered the proper paths, still quiet ceremonies conducted in secret. far from the eyes of tourists, and so the mountain stood silent, wounded, but watching. When Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor, arrived with blueprints and ambition, the mountain did not speak back. It had already been spoken over too many times, but the Lakota still knew what it once said. Even today, among the pine-scented trails and granite cliffs, you can find unmarked places where the grass grows a little taller, where wind circles in our directions, where someone has left a small offering of tobacco wrapped in red cloth. The mountain remembers. Does anyone else? Asterisk, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was not written on sacred hides or carved in stone. It was ink on parchment, drafted by men in tents, signed with names that echoed through military ranks and congressional halls. And though it bore the United States seal and promised the Black Hills to the Lakota in perpetuity, history would treat it like a child's bedtime promise, soft, soon forgotten, and too easy to break. It began with boundaries drawn by outsiders. According to the treaty, the Great Sioux Reservation stretched over vast parts of what is now South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming. The Black Hills were the heart of it, not a fringe, not a bonus. They were everything the Lakota didn't request. The treaty, they accepted it, reluctantly, after years of warfare and betrayal. They agreed to settle, to withdraw from other hunting grounds, and to let the iron horse of the railroad pass by their borders in return for peace and permanence. And most of all, they were promised that their sacred hills would never be touched. But just 8 years later, in 1874, a U.S. military expedition led by General George Armstrong Custer rode into the Black Hills under the pretense of scouting for a new fort location. What they were truly scouting for, however, was gold, and they found it. The announcement of gold in the Black Hills was like lighting a fuse. Suddenly, miners poured in by the thousands, some escorted by the army itself. Under thin excuses of protection and civilization, by 1875, prospecting camps had sprung up in Deadwood Gulch, and paths that once echoed with the chants of the Lakota were now packed with wagons, kents, and sluice boxes. The Lakota protested. They took their case to Indian agents. They petitioned Washington. The U.S. government responded not with enforcement of the treaty, but with negotiations to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota refused to sell. How do you sell your mother's heartbeat? How do you assign a dollar value to visions and memories? In 1876, the U.S. decided to take the land by force. The war for the Black Hills began. It was during this time that the Battle of the Little Bighorn was fought, where Custer met his famous end against a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters. The victory was short-lived. By the end of 1877, with starvation policies in place and military pressures suffocating their autonomy, Lakota were forced to sign a new agreement, one that stripped them of the Black Hills. Except many of the actual tribal leaders never signed it. Instead, signatures were collected by coercion under threat of withholding food or safety. Entire bands were left out, but to the U.S. Congress, the technicalities didn't matter. The law passed. The Black Hills were declared U.S. territory. The gold flowed. The timber was harvested. The sacred peaks were rechristened as real estate. For decades, the Lakota would repeat one thing: we never sold the hills. Generations of Lakota would live with this wound, passed down through stories, ceremonies, and silence. Children would hear it whispered during winter nights beside lodge fires. Elders would carry it like stone in the bones. The land wasn't just taken, it was betrayed. By the early 20th century, the Black Hills were no longer just contested land. They were romanticized, commodified, and mythologized by the American public. Tourism brochures called it God's country. Postcards showed pine-covered peaks under pastel skies. Presidents visited. Motorists cruised along winding mountain highways. No mention of the treaties. No memory of the pain. And then came Gutzon Borglum, A sculptor known for his ego as much as his artistry, Borglum dreamed of a monument that would outlive nations. He had already worked on the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain, Georgia, massive carving honoring Southern generals. Though that project was left unfinished after disputes with the sponsors, it was no coincidence that he brought his vision west in 1923. South Dakota state historian Don Robinson contacted Borglum about carving historic Western figures into the Black Hills to promote tourism. But Borglum had bigger ideas. Just Western pioneers, he argued, when you could immortalize America's greatest presidents. Not on any mountain, this mountain. The one that towered above the Lakota's most sacred heartland. It was a perfect site, Borglum insisted. The granite was strong, the slope ideal. The face of the mountain faced southeast, bathing in morning light. He did not ask what the land meant to others. He did not seek tribal approval to Borglum. The mountain was empty. In 1927, the first blasts of dynamite rang out. Drills chewed through layers of ancient rock. Faces began to emerge. George Washington first, then Jefferson, then Lincoln and Roosevelt. Each face was over 60 feet tall. Crews of immigrant workers, many of them Italian and Scandinavian, toiled high above the ground on swinging harnesses, carving eyelids, chins, and mouths. And all the while, Lakota watched too many. It was more than theft. It was desecration. This wasn't just carving into stone. It was cutting into memory, into the body of the land, into a place where spirits were supposed to dwell, now blasted open and reshaped into symbols of the very government that had violated them. And the irony was not lost. Of the 4 presidents carved into Rushmore, at least to Washington and Jefferson had directly or indirectly supported the displacement of native peoples. Lincoln, though more complicated, had approved the largest mass execution in U.S. history, the hanging of 38 Dakota men in Minnesota during the Dakota War of 1862. Even Theodore Roosevelt, though known for conservation, had once said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of 10 are." These were not neutral figures. They were too many indigenous Americans, the architects of erasure. Yet now their faces loomed from the very land they helped take. Some Lakota elders refused to look at the mountain. Others turned it into quiet strengths, speaking the truth in ceremonies and stories, showing their children knew what came before the granite eyes. And yet, the question lingers like the wind in the trees. If the land remembers what it once was, does it also remember what it could still become? It's asterisk today. Mount Rushmore stands tall, drawing over 2 million visitors a year. The parking lots are wide. The gift shops are full. American flags line the path to the Grand View Terrace, where families gather to gaze up at the chiseled faces of 4 presidents. Children run with ice cream cones. Cameras click. An orchestra of awe plays daily beneath that mountain. But few pause to ask what stood there before those faces. Or what still does. The official brochure rarely mentions the Fort Laramie Treaty. The interpretive signs speak of vision and engineering, not of broken promises or cultural grief. The Lakota name for the Black Hills Pahasapis rarely printed. And fewer still know that the land beneath their feet remains. By treaty, legally Lakota land. That's not a metaphor. That's a Supreme Court decision in 1980, after decades of protest, lawsuits, and historical research. The United States Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the Black Hills were taken illegally. The court acknowledged that the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty were violated without consent, and that the government had never provided fair compensation. As a result, the court ordered that financial restitution be made over $100 million, with interest accruing daily. But the Lakota Nation refused the money. They didn't want a payout. They wanted the land To this day, the fund remains untouched. It has grown to over $1 billion, gathering interest in a federal account. But the Lakota have consistently said the same thing. The Black Hills are not for sale. It's a quiet form of resistance, one without violence, one that stands in the shadow of a mountain that still watches. And it's a powerful one, because the mountain is not just granite. It's not just geology. It's memory. And memory has a longer half-life than stone. Meanwhile, a counter-monument is being carved slowly, deliberately, just 17 miles away from Mount Rushmore. On Thunderhead Mountain, the figure of Crazy Horse is emerging from rock. The carving, when finished, will be 563 feet high, dwarfing the presidential heads. It's being built by the descendants of Korchak Zyokowski, a sculptor who was invited by Lakota elder Henry Standing Bear to create a tribute to Native resilience and pride. The Crazy Horse Monument has its own controversies: scale, its cost, its ownership. Some Native people support it. Others question the idea of using the same tools of glorification that desecrated the Black Hills in the first place. But still, it rises. A reminder. A mirror dot. And yet, the Black Hills aren't waiting for monuments. They are mountains. They do not hurry. They do not explain. They erode slowly, like grief that never fully fades. They welcome snowfall without ceremony and let trees grow over their wounds. In quiet corners of the forest, offerings are still left: tobacco, sweetgrass, small stones with red cloth tied around them. Even as school buses unload, can visitors stare upward in awe. Some remember to look down at the ground beneath their feet, at the land that once spoke to a people in dreams and fire. The National Park Service has made attempts to include Native perspectives at Rushmore. There are now occasional cultural programs. Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota Heritage Village opens during summer months, but it remains peripheral, an afterthought, a whisper against the booming voice of national pride. The mountain story is told, but not in full, and perhaps it never will be, because to tell it fully would mean looking straight into the face of uncomfortable truths. That democracy, for all its aspirations, was carved literally into land taken by force. That patriotism can sometimes echo through hollowed promises. That even in stone, the eyes of history do not blink out still. The Lakota endure. Their language is spoken. Their songs are sung. Their children are taught the real names of places, the names that came before presidents, before generals, before tourists. In the land endures with them. In the deepest parts of the Black Hills, there are ridges with no plaques, streams with no tour names, meadows with no trail markers. These are the places where silence still has weight, where the pine smell feels ancestral, and where shadows move with something older than time. Sometimes, those who visit Rushmore stray off path. They wander into a grove and feel something heavy, something they can't name. Not sorrow, not guilt, something quieter. Like walking into a room that someone just left, a presence and absence. And maybe that's the real monument. Not the faces carved into stone, but the silence that surrounds them. The mountain was not always a monument. It was once a place of prayer, a place of dreaming, a place where names weren't needed because the land already knew you. And somewhere beneath the granite, beneath the scaffolding of history, that mountain still remembers its first name. It's waiting, not to be reclaimed, not to be bought, but simply to be remembered. Asterisk, it was April 29th, 1868. Though the snow still clung to the edges of the camp near Fort Laramie, the wind moved quietly across the open plains of what is now eastern Wyoming, brushing over worn tents, military uniforms, and the calm, wary faces of Lakota leaders who stood near the fire. The grass had yet to rise for spring, and the Missouri River was still thick with meltwater. It was there, in that strange season between freeze and thaw, that one of the most consequential treaties in American history was signed. A promise was made. A nation swore it would keep it. And a people who had already seen too many promises broken chose, perhaps with too much hope to believe, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was not the first such agreement between the United States and the Lakota. There had been other documents filled with elegant language and elaborate seals, all of them eventually forgotten by the side that had written them. But this treaty was different in scale and clarity. It did not just recognize land, guaranteed it. The Great Sioux Reservation, as it was called in the treaty, covered a vast stretch of land west of the Missouri River, encompassing large parts of present-day South Dakota and reaching into North Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Montana. Most importantly, it included the sacred Pahasapata, Black Hills. Article 2 of the treaty said plainly, no white person or persons shall be permitted to settle upon or occupy any portion of the territory, or without the consent of the Indians first had and obtained to pass through the same. That wasn't vague language, okay? That was as close to absolute as a government ever gets. But why had the United States agreed to it? Because it had little choice in the years leading up to the treaty. The U.S. military had suffered significant defeats in the northern plains. Kent, one of the most devastating, was the Fetterman Massacre of 1866, when a group of 81 U.S. soldiers was ambushed and killed near Fort Phil Kearny, led in part by the Lakota warrior Crazy Horse. The event sent shockwaves through Washington and led to a reassessment of the Army's ability to hold territory along the Bosman Trail, so the government chose peace, or the appearance of it. Negotiators met with several Lakota leaders, including Red Cloud, one of the most formidable native military leaders of the 19th century. Red Cloud had famously refused to attend any talks until the military forts along the Bosman Trail were abandoned. It was only after the Army complied and tore down its posts that he agreed to come to Fort Laramie. What Red Cloud and others wanted was not a charity. They wanted space, respect, the right to live as they had lived for generations, the right to walk their hunting grounds without being fired upon, the right to return to the Black Hills in spring and fall without finding fences and claims staked in blood. For the American officials, the treaty was strategic. It removed an obstacle to westward expansion and quieted a conflict they had begun to doubt they could win outright. So the papers were drawn up, translated, read aloud, interpreted through layers of language and worldview, and finally, signed, read. Cloud did not sign the treaty that day. He would wait another sign of his caution. He signed months later, after confirming the forts were truly gone. But others did sign. The ink dried on deer-hide bindings. The wind carried the smoke from pipe ceremonies eastward, and for a brief moment, there was peace. What no one could know not then, not fully, was that just 6 years later, the very heart of that agreement would be hollowed out, and the words that seemed so strong in April would scatter like ash in July. But that moment hadn't come yet. In 1868, for the Lakota, it seemed that maybe, just maybe, the Black Hills would remain theirs. That maybe the United States had finally said what it meant. That maybe the sun could rise again over Pahasapa without the shadows of strangers. But even then, there were doubts. Some elders whispered of past treaties, how they had begun with sweet words and ended with bitter land. Some younger warriors worried that the government's willingness to give up the Bosman Trail was not a gift, but a trap, And among the women, among those who had seen too many seasons of mourning, there were quiet glances exchanged, as if to say, this won't hold. Nothing ever does. Still, life went on. Buffalo returned to the plains in spring, moving like dark rivers across the grass. Tipis rose and fell with the seasons. Children learned the old songs, and medicine men whispered prayers in the shade of cottonwoods, and the Black Hills stood unchanged, watching in the summers that followed. Many Lakota families returned to their sacred spaces in the hills. They fasted in silence. They lit fires in stone circles. They offered prayers in high groves and followed the old trails by the sound of streams. In those moments, the treaty wasn't just law. It was breath. It was a kind of protection. But as the years passed, rumors began to move west like storm clouds. The U.S. government had authorized another military expedition. General George Armstrong Custer, a mission of exploration, to survey the Black Hills, they said. Just to look. No harm. No settlements. Just men in uniform, marching with horses and rifles into the heart of the land they had promised to leave untouched. But the Lakota knew that just looking had never ended well. And they were right, because the men weren't just looking at trees or peaks, okay? They were digging, tapping, testing. Custer's men found traces of gold, and once they did, the land changed again. Almost overnight, by 1875, the hills were full of prospectors. The treaty remained, still inked on parchment in Washington, but on the ground, it was ignored. Mines were dug, trees felled, claims staked, by white hands, and the Lakota watched, not with surprise, with fury, with heartbreak, with the heavy knowledge that history was repeating itself. Again, they went to Washington. They argued. They demanded the treaty be honored. But Washington had already made its choice, and the words that were once spoken in winter amid snow and fire were already being buried beneath the sound of drills and greed. Asterisk, the year was 1874. The air over the Black Hills was warm, scented with pine and summer dust. Elk still moved along ancient trails. Streams trickled through groves of spruce. But something else moved. 2 metal wheels, cavalry boots, canvas wagons. An expedition unlike any the Black Hills had seen was making its way deeper into the sacred heart of the land, led by General George Armstrong Custer. The 7th Cavalry wasn't there to fight at least not officially. Her mission was scientific. That was the term used in Washington. A geological reconnaissance mission, a study of the region. A harmless investigation was, they claimed, about mapping the terrain, not altering it. But there were hundreds of men, with horses, with artillery, with surveyors and scientists, with scouts and reporters, with gold pans. Custer's Black Hills expedition included 1,000 soldiers, 100 wagons, and a clear, unofficial aim to assess the region's gold potential. That's what the press had hinted at, okay? That's what the businessmen behind closed doors suspected, and it's what the Lakota feared. Because this wasn't just another breach of etiquette, okay? It was a direct violation of Article 2 of the Fort Laramie Treaty still in effect. The article that stated plainly that no white man could enter Lakota territory without express tribal consent. There had been no consent. And when Custer's team reported finding gold in paying quantities near French Creek, everything changed. The news traveled eastward like wildfire. Headlines in Chicago and New York blared with promise. Gold in the Black Hills. Untouched, untapped. The next frontier. Within months, prospectors flooded the region. They called themselves the 49ers of the 70s, but they came with pickaxes and greed, not laws or permissions. Most traveled through Bismarck, North Dakota, then south through the Dakota Territory. Others carved their own trails through Lakota lands, sometimes guarded by armed escorts, sometimes by luck. The army tried, half-heartedly, to remove the trespassers. A few arrests were made. Camps were burned down. But the effort was symbolic. At best, within a year, gold camps had grown into towns: Lakota, Lead, Custer City. What had been sacred was now property. The Lakota protested. They wrote, they sent delegations. They reminded Washington of the treaty. But the answer, in essence, was a shrug. The U.S. government knew it had broken its promise, but it also saw opportunity. The gold rush could not be stopped. Instead of honoring the treaty, officials began discussing a new one that would purchase the Black Hills, but the Lakota had no interest in selling. In 1875, negotiators arrived at the Red Cloud Agency, offering $6 million for the Black Hills, roughly 11 cents an acre. The offer was seen by many as not only insulting, but absurd. The elders refused. The hills were not real estate. They were alive. They were spirit. They were blood. What followed was a campaign of pressure, legal, economic, and military. The U.S. cut rations at agencies. It delayed annuity payments, sent veiled threats, claimed that hostile bands in the northern plains who refused to settle were violating the treaty by their very freedom. By late 1875, the government had issued an ultimatum. All uncooperative Lakota bands were ordered to report to designated agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. The order ignored the fact that winter made such travel nearly impossible. Those who could not or would not move in time were now labeled enemies. And just like that, war was justified. The U.S. military launched the Great Sioux War of 1876. It would lead to one of the most mythologized moments in American history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. But while history books remember the drama of that June day in 1876, when Custer and over 200 soldiers were killed in battle, the context is often lost. That fight did not occur in a vacuum. It was the result of broken promises, illegal invasions, and a desperate attempt by the Lakota and their allies to defend what had already been guaranteed to them. And even their victory would not save the land. In the months that followed, the U.S. intensified its war effort. Tribes were hunted down, driven into agencies, or exiled to reservations far from their homelands. In 1877, Congress passed the Agreement of 1877, a law that unilaterally took the Black Hills from the Lakota and officially removed them from the treaty map. There was no legal basis for the act. It violated the U.S. Constitution, which required tribal land cessions to have the agreement of 3/4 of adult male tribal members. That threshold was never met, but the government didn't care by then. The hills had been claimed, mined, and mapped, and the voices of protest were buried beneath the weight of profits and patriotism. Over the next decades, the Black Hills would become a site of logging, ranching, and tourism. New names replaced old ones. Sacred springs were renamed for generals. Sacred peaks became tourist viewpoints. The narrative was rewritten, and a treaty. It was filed away, forgotten, except by those who had signed it in good faith. Lakota oral tradition preserved every detail. Elders spoke of the winter of 1868, of the ceremony, the buffalo robes, the quiet wind over Fort Laramie. Children were told of the promises, how they were made, and how they were broken. They learned the shape of betrayal, and they carried that shape with them. By the 20th century, a generation had grown up without ever seeing the Black Hills as they once were. Roads now cut through valleys where vision quests once took place. Logging trucks drove over ridges that had once held sacred fires. The silence had changed, yet, even in exile, the Lakota remembered. They formed alliances, filed lawsuits, spoke before Congress, and always they repeated the same words: "We never sold the Black Hills." But if the treaty could be broken so easily, what did any promise from the United States really mean? Asterisk, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised land. As long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall flow, the Black Hills were to remain Lakota, untouched, unceded, unbought. But the grass still grows, the rivers still flow, and the promise has long been broken. What followed after 1877 wasn't merely the loss of territory. It was the erosion of sovereignty, the collapse of trust, and the slow, grinding displacement of a people from the spiritual center of their world. The Black Hills have been the axis of their belief, the lungs of their culture, and the ground where their ancestors had whispered in dreams. The legal theft was never forgotten, and so began one of the longest-running legal battles in American history. Asterisk. In the early 20th century, the Lakota and their legal allies began gathering documentation, oral testimony, and treaty records. They petitioned, they wrote, they organized, but courts dismissed their claims for decades, saying too much time had passed, that the case was closed, that the hills were settled. But memory does not observe deadlines. In 1920, the first lawsuit over the Black Hills was filed. It would take 6 decades to reach its moment of reckoning. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the Black Hills had been taken illegally. The court agreed that the terms of the 1868 treaty had been violated without lawful cession, and that the government had knowingly broken its own promise. Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote, "A more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never be found in our history." The court ordered financial compensation, then totaling $106 million to be paid to the Lakota. But the Lakota refused the money. It was never about the payout. Apita, the Black Hills were not a debt to be settled with dollars. Apita, they were not real estate on a ledger. They were sacred. Accepting the money, elders argued, would finalize the theft. It would turn a spiritual wound into a transaction. It would rewrite the story as one of sale, not seizure. And so the money was placed into a trust account where it remains untouched to this day. The amount has grown, earning interest, now totaling well over $1 billion. Still, the Lakota do not take it. They do not want compensation. They want the return of the land. Not all of it, not every acre, but a gesture, a beginning. They propose various plans co-management of sacred sites, federal to tribal land transfers, national parks built on indigenous terms. Some tribal leaders have called for the full restoration of treaty territory. Others, more modestly, have asked for the return of specific mountains, groves, canned ridges, where ceremonies could be conducted without interruption, without shame. But every offer has been met with silence, or rejection, or bureaucratic delay. Meanwhile, the hills continue to draw tourists. The state of South Dakota earns millions from park fees, timber, and land leases. Mount Rushmore, carved directly into the stolen land, remains the centerpiece of the region. American school children learn of it as a marvel of patriotism, rarely as a monument to betrayal. The irony is sharp. The very land the government was ordered to compensate for remains in its possession. The payment, sitting idle, becomes a symbol of paralysis, a monument to unfinished justice. But for the Lakota, resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, ceremonial, patient. In recent years, young Lakota activists have taken the torch from elders. They've organized marches, held sunrise ceremonies in the hills, taught history in classrooms and on reservations where textbooks still omit the truth. They've used social media to tell the story, one not of victimhood, but of resilience, because the Black Hills are more than disputed territory. They are a litmus test of America's word. It's a question left unanswered. How do you fix a promise broken over 150 years ago? Can land, once taken in betrayal, be given back in good faith? Can stone remember the truth? Some say it's too late. That tourism industry and settlement have made restitution impossible. That the past is the past. That apologies and court decisions are enough. But for many Lakota, the hills do not belong to time. They belong to spirit, and spirits do not forget. Occasionally, a visitor to the Black Hills will notice a small bundle of tobacco tied to a tree or a prayer flag fluttering from a ridge. These are not decorations. They are declarations of presence, persistence, a belief that the land still listens. In 2020, a group of Lakota youth ran 300 miles in protest, retracing ancestral trails, carrying their message to the gates of Mount Rushmore itself just days before a presidential visit. Their signs read, "Land back." Their voices echoed across the same slopes where buffalo once moved in silence, and the mountain heard them. It didn't answer, but it heard. Today, some progress is being made. Federal land buybacks have returned slivers of ancestral territory. Cultural centers and heritage programs are growing. More Americans are learning the real story behind the treaties, the wars, and the land. But the Black Hills are still not home. Not yet. The wind still moves through pine branches with the same old weight. The stars still rise over Bear Butte. The earth beneath the granite still holds stories handled, unclaimed, unresolved. And perhaps that's where this story must rest for now. Not with the solution, but with the question. What is the value of a mountain? What is the price of a promise? And what would it mean, not in law, but in spirit, for a nation to finally keep its word? Asterisk, it didn't begin with a roar, not with gunfire or headlines or a proclamation. It began with a pickaxe, a glint, pan of water on a summer afternoon. It was 1874, and deep in the heart of the Black Hills land, still legally protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, men in uniform began to crouch by stream beds and dig, quietly, curiously. They sifted through sediment near French Creek, letting the will, muddy water swirl through their hands, watching the heavier particles settle at the bottom. And then it appeared tiny, bright, real, gold. They didn't cheer. Not right away. They marked the spot, recorded it, sent word back to General George Armstrong Custer, who led the expedition, a team to the press. Within weeks, the rumors were public. Within months, the invasion had begun. They called it the Black Hills Gold Rush, but that name hides everything. What it truly was an avalanche of greed, of ambition, of settlers and speculators, of broken treaties and military force dressed as security, all set in motion by the soft whisper of gold and water. The soldiers had been the first violators of the treaty, but they were soon followed by thousands more. Prospectors arrived with shovels and rifles. Merchants came to sell them supplies. Towns sprang up almost overnight. Custer City, Hill City, Deadwood. No government authorization, no legal permission. All of it stood in violation of Article 2 of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed that the Black Hills belonged exclusively to the Lakota people. But in the minds of the newcomers, the treaty didn't matter. Gold had been found. That was reason enough. The Lakota called it Wasitchu-Waken, the white man's sacred thing. Not sacred in spirit, but in obsession. The way it warped minds, erased promises, bent the laws of man and land. They watched again as outsiders moved into a place they had never been invited. It wasn't just the presence of gold, it was the disease of it. It's the hunger it birthed in otherwise ordinary men. The way it made good neighbors turn to trespassers, made governments forget their own oaths. To the Lakota, the hills were alive, not metaphorically. Truly, they believed spirits lived in the caves, in the stones, in the streams. Vision quests had been undertaken in these woods. Ancestors buried beneath their slopes. Every peak, every bend, every rock formation had a name and a purpose. And now, men with tents and dynamite were blowing holes into those names. At first, some tribal leaders hoped it would pass, that the rush would be brief, that nature would push them back. But hope, as it so often does in history, quickly turned to grief, because the prospectors weren't just men with pans, they were men with guns. Conflicts broke out. Lakota warriors confronted trespassers. Warnings were issued. But by 1875, violence had erupted in several parts of the hills. Settlers demanded protection. Claimed the Lakota were attacking without cause. The U.S. military responded by increasing its presence in the area to remove the illegal settlers, to protect them. In this way, the rush became a war, but not just a war of bullets, a war of WORLDVIEWS to the U.S. government and its citizens. The Black Hills were valuable because of what was under them. To the Lakota, they were valuable because of what had always been above them: sky, spirit, story. The irony is profound. Men searched the hills for gold, while trampling the very things that had always made them holy. They saw the land as unspoiled wilderness, while ignoring the centuries of history and meaning woven into every pine needle. They tore open sacred caves looking for quartz veins and left behind broken rock, broken trails, broken names. As towns grew, they brought with them the infrastructure of permanence: rail lines, telegraphs, timber mills. Laws made by those who had never lived there, forced by sheriffs whose badges came with federal approval. Deadwood became the symbol of this transformation. Known today for its myths of outlaws and gunfights, its origin is far less romantic. It was built illegally in the heart of treaty-protected territory. Its saloons and brothels weren't signs of frontier grit. They were evidence of a legal fiction that the land no longer belonged to those who had been promised it. The Lakota, meanwhile, were pushed farther from their sacred places. Vision quests were disrupted by noise and strangers. Ceremonies had to be relocated. Entire clans were forced to travel hundreds of miles just to find quiet ground untouched by pickaxes. And yet, the Lakota did not leave entirely. Some stayed near the hills, quietly, defiantly. They continued to fast in the old places, to whisper prayers in the old language. They knew the hills were still listening. That the gold beneath could never replace the stories above. But those stories were hard to tell in the face of cannons. By 1876, Deadwood was no longer a camp. It was a city of tents and timber, noise and want. Perched in a narrow gulch in the northern Black Hills, it grew faster than its own streets could be named. Within months, Deadwood had saloons, gambling halls, and makeshift hotels. Miners swarmed in from all directions, pitching tents on land that had once been Lakota fasting grounds, building cabins on ridges where elders once prayed for dreams. The hills no longer echoed with drums. Now they rang with pianos and the sharp crack of pistols at the height of the rush. Over 5,000 people crowded into the gulch, each chasing the shimmer of a golden future, and each justifying their place with the same logic. The land wasn't being used properly before. It's a phrase repeated throughout history, a phrase that erases cultures, beliefs, and the slow rhythms of people who do not build cities to prove their presence. Deadwood was lawless in name, but ordered by economy. Its real order came not from sheriffs or courts, but from ounces of gold, of whiskey, of flesh. Prospectors came with dreams, but most left with debts. Few struck it rich. Most struck rock. But the dream persisted because the system needed it to. And underneath it all, the earth shifted. The Lakota did not vanish during this time. Though many were pushed to the edges of the hills, some watched from afar. Others came back quietly, at night, walking old paths under moonlight, gathering stones from sacred asterisks. The gold rush in the Black Hills is often remembered through filtered photographs and Hollywood myths, sepia-toned images of rugged miners, gamblers in waistcoats, and dirt-streaked towns built on ambition. But beyond the postcards and legends was something older, something deeper, a silence that stretched beneath the gold dust and the saloon laughter. The Lakota never called it a rush. They called it a desecration. By the time the mines were booming and dead wood was dancing, the spirit of the hills had been carved open, but it had not disappeared. The Black Hills had long memories. They had watched glaciers come and go. They had watched tribes rise, migrate, and settle. They had seen ceremonies in languages older than English, and they continued to listen. Even when dynamite shook their roots, the gold that had ignited a frenzy brought little lasting prosperity. Most miners left poorer than they arrived. The Homestake mine survived and eventually grew into the largest and deepest gold mine in North America, operating until 2002. But even that empire, with its vast tunnels stretching over 350 miles underground, could not rewrite the truth. The gold was never meant to be found. Not like that. It was as if the land itself had tried to protect it, burying it beneath sacred ridges, weaving it through veins that could not be seen without breaking the bones of the earth. When those bones were broken, the earth did not scream, it simply remembered. And the Lakota did. To dot through the decades, the Lakota never ceased to speak of the theft. Every generation inherited the story not as folklore, but as fact. Children grew up hearing the names of the creeks, the peaks, the sacred sites that had once been theirs. They learned about the treaty not from textbooks, but from elders who had held the original words in their mouths and passed them like fire. The 20th century brought new terms: sovereignty, land claims, reparations, but the core remained the same. The Black Hills were stolen, not sold, in the 1920s and 30s. As Mount Rushmore was being carved just a short distance away, the Lakota were still banned from practicing many of their ceremonies under federal law. While tourists gazed at the emerging faces of Washington and Lincoln, Lakota elders were being arrested for performing sun dances. While granite fell in elegant slabs from the mountain, the descendants of those who once fasted on those cliffs were being confined to reservations far from the land that had once shaped their every season. But even in confinement, memory continued. At Wounded Knee, place already soaked in the blood of a massacre, new generation of Native activists rose. The American Indian movement, AIM, occupied the town in protest, drawing national attention to broken treaties, especially the loss of the Black Hills. Armed federal standoffs followed. Headlines flared. And again, America turned its attention briefly to a story it had buried. But the Black Hills did not flare. They stood in 1980. The U.S. Supreme Court declared what the Lakota had known for over a century, that the land was taken illegally, that the Fort Laramie Treaty had been violated. That money was owed, but the Lakota refused the money. They understood something the court never could. You cannot buy back spirit. You cannot place a dollar amount on ancestors, on vision, on land that breathes. To accept the money, many believed, would be to accept the theft. So the billion-dollar settlement still sits untouched, and the hills continue to watch tourism surged. In the latter half of the 20th century, roads were widened, trails built. The Black Hills became a vacation destination. Mount Rushmore was rebranded as a symbol of unity, of democracy, carved into nature. Its plaques rarely mention the Lakota. Visitors take selfies beneath granite presidents, while only a few miles away. Tribal communities struggle with poverty, underfunded schools, and limited healthcare on land that once nourished them freely. Yet, the Lakota still return to the hills, not for politics, not for spectacle, but for ceremony. In quiet corners of the forest, behind campgrounds and trail signs, they still gather. Cloth bundles are tied to branches. Tobacco is placed on stones. Young people are taught how to sit in silence for 4 days and 4 nights. No food, no water, just the wind and the spirits of the land. The gold is gone. The mines are silent. But the hills are not. They whisper when the wind moves just right. They hold warmth even after sunset. They remember the footsteps of warriors and children. And they remember the silence that came after the gold. Today, many Lakota youth are reclaiming their language, their ceremonies, their stories. Elders walk with them through the hills and say, "This ridge had a name. This stream had a song. This tree saw your great-grandmother pray." They do not speak of vengeance, they speak of return. And so, beneath the surface of the tourist maps and state signs, a second map exists, a sacred map, held in memory, trailed through time, not drawn with roads, but with breath. And on that trail, the war never really ended, because the gold rush didn't just ignite a war between soldiers and warriors. It ignited a deeper war between memory and forgetting, between a promise and a prophet, between the silence of spirits and the noise of a nation that still struggles to hear them. But if you stand very still somewhere deep in the Black Hills and close your eyes, you might just feel it. The mountain breathing, the earth remembering, and something ancient, not lost, but waiting. Asterisk in the early 20th century. Before the drills and scaffolds, before the dynamite echoed through the Black Hills, there was only an idea. It came not from the Lakota, not from the federal government, not even from a community looking to build unity. It came from one man, an artist with a chisel in his hand and an empire in his mind. His name was Gutzon Borglum, and he was not, by any means, just a sculptor. Born in 1867 in Idaho Territory to Mormon-Danish immigrants, Borglum carried with him a complicated lineage. His father had 2 wives sisters, though the family later left the Mormon faith. Gutzon was raised in a household of silence and strict discipline, where artistry was both escape and salvation. He studied art in Paris, mingled briefly with Auguste Rodin, and returned to America filled with ambition, but not just to carve, to shape identity. Borglum believed in monuments, not simply as art, but as declarations. He once wrote that the purpose of sculpture was to fix in place the great dreams of a people. But whose dreams? At what cost? By the 1910s, Borglum was already known for his nationalist leanings. He admired power, order, grand gestures carved in granite. K didn't just want to sculpt a figure. He wanted to craft a myth, which is why his first major commission was Stone Mountain's Georgia Memorial to the Confederacy. That's where the story DARKENS. In 1915, United Daughters of the Confederacy hired Borglum to carve a massive monument, 2 Confederate leaders into the side of Stone Mountain. They envisioned Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson all riding together in defiance of time. Borglum accepted, and he did more than sculpt. He joined the cause. In letters, in speeches, he spoke openly of saving the white race. He became associated deeply, perhaps too deeply, with the reborn Ku Klux Klan, which had revived that same year with a fiery cross atop Stone Mountain. Borglum attended their rallies. He shared their vision of American purity, though he would later distance himself from their violence. To him, the Klan was a vehicle, pathway to patronage, network of power he could ride to glory. But the Stone Mountain Project soured. By the mid-1920s, disputes over funding, design, and ego led to his dismissal. Borglum destroyed his models in rage and walked away, leaving the carving half-finished and his southern sponsors fuming. He needed redemption. He needed something bigger. That's when the Black Hills came calling in 1923. Don Robinson, a South Dakota state historian, envisioned a monument in the Black Hills to attract tourists. First, he imagined carvings of local frontier heroes, like Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill, and Red Cloud, something folksy, regional, asterisk. But when Borglum got involved, he said no. Why settle for local legends, he asked, when you could carve America itself? Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt, a pantheon of presidents, not in a museum, not in marble, but in a mountain. Borglum chose Mount Rushmore not because of its meaning to native people, but because of its slope, its granite quality, and its orientation to the sun. It faced southeast, which meant sunlight from dawn to midday, a perfect natural spotlight. He never asked what the mountain meant to the Lakota. To him, the mountain was empty, blank, waiting, and so the most ambitious carving project in U.S. history was born not out of reverence, but out of need, out of one man's desire to leave behind something bigger than himself. But Borglum wasn't just building a monument. He was rewriting a narrative. He believed in American exceptionalism, in manifest destiny, in the inevitability of empire. Carving presidents into native land, he wasn't creating irony. He was completing the story to him. The Black Hills weren't sacred. They were symbolic. A canvas for victory, for permanence, for dominance. He once said, Mount Rushmore is to be American, drawn from American sources, memorializing American achievement. But whose America? Whose achievement secured federal backing in the late 1920s? President Calvin Coolidge endorsed the project. Congress appropriated funds, and in 1927, construction began. Workers climbed the mountain with drills and dynamite. Every blast erased millions of years of natural shape. Every chisel stroke transformed granite into narrative, and Gutzon Borglum watched it, all like a conductor, like a general, like a prophet. But as his dream grew taller, the silence beneath it deepened. Few asked what the Lakota thought. Few remembered that this mountain was still part of the land illegally taken after the Gold Rush. Few noticed that the chosen figures Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt each had a role, direct or indirect, in the dispossession of native lands. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a design to carve them into the Black Hills, was to claim the land again, not with paper, but with stone, not through law, but through legacy. And in Borglum's mind, legacy was worth everything, even if it meant erasure, even if it meant carving triumph into the very bones of betrayal. Asterisk, the mountain didn't yield easily. By 1927, the site had been chosen. Funding had trickled in. Scaffolding clung to the granite face like scaffolding always does, temporary, awkward, fragile looking. Mount Rushmore was anything but fragile. A Desarta stone, millions of years old. Ancient granite, laid bare to the wind, now drilled and blasted with industrial urgency. Gutzon Borglum stood at the base of the mountain almost every day, directing his crew with a mixture of theatrical grandeur and absolute precision. T's hat tilted back, his coat brushing against stone dust. He wasn't merely a sculptor. He was commander of a silent army, and what an army it was. Between 1927 and 1941, more than 400 men worked on Mount Rushmore. Most were not sculptors. They were miners, stoneworkers, laborers, immigrants from Italy, Sweden, Germany. Men who had come from broken economies and war-racked cities in search of work and wages, dangled from ropes, wielded jackhammers, handled explosives, braved the bitter South Dakota winters in the sweltering sun of high summer, often without safety, equipment, or insurance. No one died during the construction, a remarkable fact given the scale of the danger. But injuries were common. Hearing loss, crushed fingers, broken limbs. Their names were never carved. Their stories rarely told. When people gaze at the towering faces of Washington and Jefferson, few think about the men who shaped each eyelid and nostril, the ones who held the drills, who mixed the powder, carved cheekbones 1 inch at a time. They built a monument to history and vanished from it. For Borglum, the mountain was never just a workplace. It was a stage, a symbol, a final masterpiece. He would patrol the site like a battlefield, barking orders, sketching revisions, demanding changes in scale. At one point, he changed the design of Jefferson's face entirely, moving it to the other side of Washington. He believed that the monument had to speak with power, it had to be immortal. But while the public saw precedents, Borglum saw himself. Every detail was personal, every contour a legacy. He had enemies in Washington, skeptics, who questioned the cost, the delays, the ambition. But he also had allies, senators, governors, presidents. He wrote letters constantly lobbying for funds, for praise, for permanence. He believed that when the mountain was finished, his name would be spoken in the same breath as the founding fathers. He would not live to see the end. Construction began in earnest with George Washington in 1930. His face took nearly 7 years to complete. Jefferson followed, then Lincoln, and finally Theodore Roosevelt. Each face was roughly 60 feet tall, their eyes about 11 feet wide, noses stretching 20 feet long. Dynamite was used for 90% of the carving. It was a brutal, noisy process. Each day, workers drilled small holes into the granite, then black powder, or dynamite was inserted, and the mountain would roar. Chunks of ancient stone tumbled down the slopes. Dust filled the air, and the mountain's silence was shattered again and again 4 years. But even as the physical monument took shape, its meaning twisted. To some, it was a marvel, a triumph of American will, a testament to democracy etched into eternity. To others, it was desecration made permanent. Among the Lakota, there were no words for the carving. There was only grief. The faces were not just stoned, they were wounds. George Washington, the father of a new nation, who had also sent troops to suppress indigenous resistance. Thomas Jefferson, who envisioned an empire of liberty, while drafting removal plans for native peoples. Abraham Lincoln, his administration ordered the largest mass execution in U.S. history, the hanging of 38 Dakota men in 1862. Theodore Roosevelt, who once said that the Native American was a savage fading before civilization, carved into sacred Lakota land, towering above the pines where prayers had once been whispered. The irony was too sharp to ignore. The very men who symbolized the expansion and consolidation of American power were now fossilized in the hills they helped to seize. The monument didn't just celebrate history, overrode it, and Borglum knew this, at least in part. He had no interest in indigenous history, said. He viewed native resistance as an obstacle to progress. To him, the hills were a perfect backdrop for a national gospel. The Lakota were not part of that gospel. He once called the project the American Mecca, but whose pilgrimage was it meant for? In the late 1930s, the work began to stall. Funding dried up. The Depression had tightened budgets. World War II was looming. Borglum grew older, weaker, still ambitious, still writing, still revising the plans. He wanted full torsos, entire scenes battles, documents, maps carved beneath the faces. He envisioned an entablature, a grand explanation of American destiny, chiseled into the mountainside. But in March 1941, he died. His son, Lincoln Borglum, took over. The work continued briefly, but the scope was scaled back. The torsos were never built. The entablature never realized. The funding never arrived. On October 31st, 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, work officially ceased. And that was it. The mountain was declared complete, though the dreams behind it were not. Borglum's name was etched into history, if not the mountain itself. He had carved his myth, but he had also left behind a silence the kind that hovers in unfinished work, in stories untold, into space between legacy and consequence. And beneath that silence, the hills endured, wounded, carved, unrecognizable, but not dead. Asterisk, the final blast of dynamite echoed through the black hills on a cold morning in late October 1941. Workers descended their scaffolds for the last time, folding away blueprints and packing up drills. The sky was pale, the forest below rustled with the breath of oncoming winter. Above them, the four presidents gazed eastward, finished enough to declare complete, yet never quite what their sculptor had envisioned. Gutzon Borglum had died just months earlier. He never saw the work end, never witnessed the last chip of granite fall from the mountain he devoted to decades of his life to. His son, Lincoln Borglum, had done what he could to preserve the vision, but the war in Europe had begun to consume America's attention. Funds were cut, tourism dwindled, and so the project stopped mid-thought, mid-dream, mid-monument. Mount Rushmore was declared finished, but it never really was. Today, visitors to the site often don't realize that the original plans were far more elaborate. Borglum had wanted each president depicted down to the waist, with their arms folded across stone chests. He envisioned a massive vault behind the faces, a hall of records where the founding documents of America would be stored for eternity. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, presidential biographies, a literal archive of democracy carved into granite. He wanted future civilizations thousands of years from now to find this place and understand who Americans were, what they believed, what they built, what they thought was worth remembering. But the Hall of Records was never completed. Only a rough tunnel exists today, sealed behind Lincoln's head, barely accessible and closed to the public. Instead, what remains is the facade. The faces frozen, immense, unblinking, asterisk. To many, they are inspiring symbols of perseverance and unity. To others, they are reminders of conquest carved into a land that never consented. The Lakota people still called the mountain Tu Ga'ila ACP, the six grandfathers. It was a sacred place long before Borglum or Rushmore, long before the United States. The name referred not to men, but to spiritual forces: earth, sky, north, south, east, and west. The mountain was not a canvas, it was a sanctuary. Now, those six grandfathers lie hidden beneath the faces of four American presidents. The Lakota, along with many other indigenous nations, have never accepted the monument. They view it as a spiritual injury, a desecration not just of land, but of memory. A wound carved so deep it could be seen from miles away. And yet, year after year, tourists arrive. They stand at the Grand View Terrace, raising phones to capture the granite faces. Children eat soft pretzels, while miniature American flags flutter from gift shop racks. Few pause to ask who the mountain once belonged to. Fewer still learn about the Fort Laramie Treaty, or the gold rush that broke it, or the sculptor whose dream, so intertwined with ego and empire, ignored the voices buried beneath the granite. Even fewer visit the Crazy Horse Memorial, just a short drive away, still under construction after more than 70 years. There, the face of the Lakota warrior slowly emerges from Thunderhead Mountain, massive and deliberate, a counter-monument, a reclamation, not just of land, but of story. But even that project is not without controversy. Some native people question whether carving another mountain truly restores what was taken. Can an answer to desecration be built with the same tools? Others say yes, that presence matters, that visibility matters, that even stone can resist silence. Still, for most Lakota people, resistance isn't always loud. It lives in a quiet in ceremonies held deep within the Black Hills, far from tour buses and cameras, in prayer ties left on trees near sacred springs, in children taught to say Pahasapa instead of Mount Rushmore, in lawsuits that stretch for decades, and a refusal to accept $1 billion payout for land that was never for sale, and in the simple act of remembering, because Borglum's faces may loom large, but they do not erase. They cannot. Memory does not yield to dynamite. Over time, erosion will take its toll. Wind will soften the outlines, Snow and rain will creep into cracks. Lichen may touch the eyes. But long before that, the land may find other ways to speak, in the movement of elk at dawn, in the hush of pine needles at dusk, in the way a child places tobacco at the base of an old stone, and in the quiet knowledge that monuments rise and fall, but land remains. Perhaps that is what Borglum never understood. He wanted to carve permanence, to etch power into the earth. But he could not hear the stories that were already there, could not see the spirits that moved through the granite. Long before drills ever arrived, he looked at a mountain and saw presidents. The Lakota looked at the same mountain and saw ancestors. And perhaps, quote, one day, more people will learn to see both, not to undo what was done, not to erase the faces, but to widen the view, to tell the fuller story, to remember the names that were never carved, and to listen not to the granite voices above, but to the silence beneath them. Asterisk, the Black Hills had stood for hundreds of millions of years before anyone ever tried to measure them. They weren't designed, they weren't engineered, simply were the result of uplift, pressure, and time. And yet, in the 20th century, men arrived not to walk them, but to reshape them. This is the story of the tools they brought: the scaffolds, the blueprints, the drills, the dynamite, the goggles and belts and lunch pails, the wind swaying harnesses, the way the sound of each explosion echoed off pine trees, bounced through canyons, and landed in ears that still remembered the sacred songs once sung on those slopes. Mount Rushmore wasn't just imagined into existence. It was forced into being inch by inch, blast by blast. When work officially began in 1927, the mountain was raw and untamed. It had no name that most Americans recognized. To the Lakota, it was still the Six Grandfathers. To the early settlers, it was just another peak until a lawyer named Charles E. Rushmore asked about it during a mining trip in 1885. The name stuck. No ceremony, permission, since the question turned into a legacy Gutzon Borglum had chosen. It for its granite in its southeastern face, perfect for sunlight. But to carve into that granite would require something more than imagination. It required geometry, physics, and the capacity for controlled violence. He started with models. In a studio below the mountain, he built a 1/12 scale replica of what he wanted the final monument to be. Every inch on the model represented 1 foot on the mountain. This model sat surrounded by plaster dust, measurement charts, and chains. Lots of chains. The process they used was called pointing. From the model to the mountain, every measurement had to be scaled up perfectly. A metal frame called a pointing machine was used. It connected the model surface to a corresponding point on the mountain. Think of it like a giant 3D grid stretched across air. Using protractors, plumb lines, and calipers, each contour of the nose, each ridge of the eyebrow was translated into granite by degrees and drills. But no human hand could sculpt 60-foot faces without help. So they used dynamite. More than 90% of Mount Rushmore was carved, not with chisels, but with explosives. Workers drilled deep holes into the granite, packed them with black powder or dynamite, and detonated them in carefully timed bursts. Whole slabs fell. Sometimes 50 to 100 tons of rock would be removed in a single day. The explosions were followed by men with jackhammers and bushhammers, heavy pneumatic tools that pounded stone into shape. The work was dangerous, loud, and repetitive. The sound never stopped. Workers wore cotton in their ears and goggles on their eyes, but still, the granite dust coated everything: their hair, their lungs, caves, their food. They worked on suspended platforms, thin cables, metal carriages, and swinging wooden boxes. There were no harnesses in the early days. A misstep meant death. Yet no one died during the 14 years of construction, a fact often cited as a point of pride, though injuries were common. The days began early. Most workers stayed in nearby keystone or temporary camps near the site. They brought their own lunches, their own thermoses. They had no health insurance, no pensions, but the pay was steady, and for men who had just lived through the Great Depression, that was enough. Some were trained stonecutters. Others were former miners. A few were artists. Most were not. They were simply men who knew how to break rock. Every contour of the president's faces required dozens of workers moving in sync. A nose could take a year. The eye pupils were created using sunburst patterns as central drill hole surrounded by radio. Chiseling to give the illusion of depth and shine. Sometimes the granite resisted. Jefferson's original position was to the left of Washington, but the granite there cracked. It wasn't stable, so Borglum blasted it away and began again on the other side. That's why Jefferson looks cramped, his face pressed close to Washington's. A compromise of geology and ego. Borglum obsessed over detail. He altered Lincoln's face to deepen the melancholy. He insisted Roosevelt be shown with his pince nez. Glass is a delicate feature requiring fine carving within coarse stone. The work was relentless and invisible to most. Newspapers published photos of the mountain in progress, but few Americans understood what it took. The sweat, the design errors, the mathematical recalculations, the moments when a nose seemed too wide, when a chin crumbled, when an eye socket veered off-center and had to be corrected with new explosives. There was no blueprint for this kind of monument. Only instinct, models, and trial by hammer. The mountain changed not only in shape, but in sound. The forest that once carried bird calls and the hum of wind through needles now rang with steel and stone. Birds flew differently around the peak. Elk kept their distance. Even the trees near the base began to grow, stunted, affected by falling rock and displaced soil. To the Lakota, the changes were not just physical, they were spiritual. Each blast, they said, tore a piece from the body of the hills. Ceremonial spaces vanished. The pathways to certain fasting spots became impassable. Prayers once offered on open stone now echoed against the hollowed-out cheekbone of a president who had never set foot there. But construction continued through the stock market crash of 1929, through the Dust Bowl years, through Roosevelt's New Deal era. Each administration offered just enough funding to keep the work going, though not enough to complete the vision. Borglum wanted full torsos. He wanted a grand inscription. He wanted staircases, vaults, sculptures, of maps. His mountain was meant to explain America, not just depict it, but granted, budget cuts. And death intervened. In 1941, just before the U.S. entered World War II, the work was called off. What remained were the four faces, unfinished but iconic. No arms, no bodies, no inscription. No hall of rectisect for a sealed cavern hidden from public view, where a few panels now sit in a titanium box outlining the meaning of the monument for distant futures. But even if no one ever finds that box, the mountain speaks in drills and dust, in silence and scars, in the rough strokes that shaped a nation's myth on land that never asked for it. And while the world sees the faces, the stone remembers the violence. Asterisk. To many, they are inspiring symbols of perseverance and unity. To others, they are reminders of conquest carved into a land that never consented. The Lakota people still called the mountain Tu Ga'ila ACP, the six grandfathers. It was a sacred place long before Borglum or Rushmore, long before the United States. The name referred not to men, but to spiritual forces, earth, sky, north, south, east, and west. The mountain was not a canvas, it was a sanctuary. Now, those six grandfathers lie hidden beneath the faces of four American presidents. The Lakota along with many other indigenous nations, have never accepted the monument. They view it as a spiritual injury, a desecration not just of land, but of memory. A wound carved so deep it could be seen from miles away. And yet, year after year, tourists arrive. They stand at the Grand View Terrace, raising phones to capture the granite faces. Children eat soft pretzels, while miniature American flags flutter from gift shop racks. Few pause to ask who the mountain once belonged to. Fewer still learn about the Fort Laramie Treaty, or the gold rush that broke it, or the sculptor whose dream, so intertwined with ego and empire, ignored the voices buried beneath the granite. Even fewer visit the Crazy Horse Memorial, just a short drive away, still under construction after more than 70 years. There, the face of the Lakota warrior slowly emerges from Thunderhead Mountain, massive and deliberate, a counter-monument, a reclamation, not just of land, but of story. But even that project is not without controversy. Some native people question whether carving another mountain truly restores what was taken. Can an answer to desecration be built with the same tools? Others say yes, that presence matters, that visibility matters, that even stone can resist silence. Still, for most Lakota people, resistance isn't always loud. It lives in a quiet dot, in ceremonies held deep within the Black Hills, far from tour buses and cameras, in prayer ties left on trees near sacred springs, in children taught to say Pahasapa instead of Mount Rushmore, in lawsuits that stretch for decades, and a refusal to accept a billion-dollar payout for land that was never for sale, and in the simple act of remembering, because Borglum's faces may loom large, but they do not erase. They cannot. Memory does not yield to dynamite. Over time, erosion will take its toll. Wind will soften the outlines. Snow and rain will creep into cracks. Lichen may touch the eyes. But long before that, the land may find other ways to speak, in the movement of elk at dawn, in the hush of pine needles at dusk, in the way a child places tobacco at the base of an old stone, and in the quiet knowledge that monuments rise and fall, but land remains. Perhaps that is what Borglum never understood. He wanted to carve permanence, to etch power into the earth, but he could not hear the stories that were already there, could not see the spirits that moved through the granite. Long before drills ever arrived, he looked at a mountain and saw presidents. The Lakota looked at the same mountain and saw ancestors, and perhaps, quote, one day, more people will learn to see both, not to undo what was done, not to erase the faces, but to widen the view, to tell the fuller story, to remember the names that were never carved, and to listen not to the granite voices above, but to the silence beneath them. Asterisk, the Black Hills had stood for hundreds of millions of years before anyone ever tried to measure them. They weren't designed, they weren't engineered, simply were the result of uplift, pressure, and time. And yet, in the 20th century, men arrived not to walk them, but to reshape them. This is the story of the tools they brought: the scaffolds, the blueprints, the drills, the dynamite, the goggles and belts and lunch pails, the wind-swaying harnesses, the way the sound of each explosion echoed off pine trees, bounced through canyons, and landed in ears that still remembered the sacred songs once sung on those slopes. Mount Rushmore wasn't just imagined into existence. It was forced into being inch by inch, blast by blast. When work officially began in 1927, the mountain was raw and untamed, It had no name that most Americans recognized, To the Lakota, it was still the six grandfathers. To the early settlers, it was just another peak until a lawyer named Charles E. Rushmore asked about it during a mining trip in 1885. The name stuck. No ceremony, permission, since the question turned into a legacy Gutzon Borglum had chosen. It for its granite in its southeastern face, perfect for sunlight. But to carve into that granite would require something more than imagination. It required geometry, physics, and the capacity for controlled violence. He started with models. In a studio below the mountain, he built a 1/12 scale replica of what he wanted the final monument to be. Every inch on the model represented 1 foot on the mountain. This model sat surrounded by plaster dust, measurement charts, and chains. Lots of chains. The process they used was called pointing. From the model to the mountain, every measurement had to be scaled up perfectly. A metal frame called a pointing machine was used. It connected the model surface to a corresponding point on the mountain. Think of it like a giant 3D grid stretched across air. Using protractors, plumb lines, and calipers, each contour of the nose, each ridge of the eyebrow was translated into granite by degrees and drills. But no human hand could sculpt 60-foot faces without help. So they used dynamite. More than 90% of Mount Rushmore was carved, not with chisels, but with explosives. Workers drilled deep holes into the granite, packed them with black powder or dynamite, and detonated them in carefully timed bursts. Whole slabs fell. Sometimes 50 to 100 tons of rock would be removed in a single day. The explosions were followed by men with jackhammers and bush hammers, heavy pneumatic tools that pounded stone into shape. The work was dangerous, loud, and repetitive. The sound never stopped. Workers wore cotton in their ears and goggles on their eyes, but still, the granite dust coated everything: their hair, their lungs, their food. They worked on suspended platforms, thin cables, metal carriages, and swinging wooden boxes. There were no harnesses in the early days. A misstep meant death. Yet no one died during the 14 years of construction, a fact often cited as a point of pride, though injuries were common. The days began early. Most workers stayed in nearby keystone or temporary camps near the site. They brought their own lunches, their own thermoses. They had no health insurance, no pensions, but the pay was steady, and for men who had just lived through the Great Depression, that was enough. Some were trained stonecutters. Others were former miners. A few were artists. Most were not. They were simply men who knew how to break rock. Every contour of the president's faces required dozens of workers moving in sync. A nose could take a year. The eye pupils were created using sunburst patterns, a central drill hole surrounded by radio. Chiseling to give the illusion of depth and shine. Sometimes the granite resisted. Jefferson's original position was to the left of Washington, but the granite there cracked. It wasn't stable, so Borglum blasted it away and began again on the other side. That's why Jefferson looks cramped, his face pressed close to Washington's. A compromise of geology and ego. Borglum obsessed over detail. He altered Lincoln's face to deepen the melancholy. He insisted Roosevelt be shown with his pince nez. Glass is a delicate feature requiring fine carving within coarse stone. The work was relentless and invisible to most. Newspapers published photos of the mountain in progress, but few Americans understood what it took. The sweat, the design errors, the mathematical recalculations, the moments when a nose seemed too wide, when a chin crumbled, when an eye socket veered off-center and had to be corrected with new explosives. There was no blueprint for this kind of monument. Only instinct, models, and trial by hammer. The mountain changed not only in shape, but in sound. The forest that once carried bird calls and the hum of wind through needles now rang with steel and stone. Birds flew differently around the peak. Elk kept their distance. Even the trees near the base began to grow, stunted, affected by falling rock and displaced soil. To the Lakota, the changes were not just physical, they were spiritual. Each blast, they said, tore a piece from the body of the hills. Ceremonial spaces vanished. The pathways to certain fasting spots became impassable. Prayers once offered on open stone now echoed against the hollowed-out cheekbone of a president who had never set foot there. But construction continued through the stock market crash of 1929, through the Dust Bowl years, through Roosevelt's New Deal era. Each administration offered just enough funding to keep the work going, though not enough to complete the vision. Borglum wanted full torsos. He wanted a grand inscription. He wanted staircases, vaults, sculptures, of maps. His mountain was meant to explain America, not just depict it, but grant it. Budget cuts. And death intervened. In 1941, just before the U.S. entered World War II, the work was called off. What remained were the four faces, unfinished but iconic. No arms, no bodies, no inscription. No hall of rectisect for a sealed cavern hidden from public view, where a few panels now sit in a titanium box outlining the meaning of the monument for distant futures. But even if no one ever finds that box, the mountain speaks in drills and dust, in silence and scars, in the rough strokes that shaped a nation's myth on land that never asked for it. And while the world sees the faces, the stone remembers the violence. Asterisk. There are those who ask, should the monument be removed? But stone does not easily forget, and neither do people. Perhaps the more important question is, should the full story be told? What if every tour guide spoke not only of carving techniques, but of broken treaties? What if every school book included the voices of those whose lands were taken for the sake of granite faces? What if the Hall of Records was filled not with declarations, but with testimonies? Maybe then the mountain would begin to heal, because the true monument isn't the stone, it's the story. And stories, unlike stone, can be shared. They can carry complexity. They can hold contradiction, okay? They can speak of beauty and betrayal. In the same breath, they can honor skill without ignoring silence. They can name the workers who were never remembered, the songs that were never sung again, the faces that were never carved but were always there. So what remains after the dust settles? A mountain, a silence, and a choice to see only what was added, or to hear what was taken away. Asterisk. It started with a sound, not loud at first, just a distant rhythm, dull echo through the trees, like thunder buried beneath the soil. But it was not thunder. It did not roll and fade like a storm passing over prairie. It came at regular intervals, predictable, measured, mechanical. Boom, silence, boom, silence. Then came the dustifying, gray and strange, carried by wind that had always been clean. The birds startled more easily. The deer moved deeper into the forest, and the air itself felt different, like it had been stirred by a hand that did not belong to it. That was how the Lakota families knew something had begun. They did not need newspapers to tell them. The families living on Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and Cheyenne River reservations had long learned to feel the world changing through signs. They watched the trees, they listened to the birds. Okay? They saw how the rivers curved slightly each season, wearing down new stone. They noticed when the land stopped speaking the way it used to. And so, even though Mount Rushmore was far miles away through winding roads and legal fictions, they felt it. Not in a tourist sense, not as a patriotic project, but as a wound that had reopened in slow motion to the children growing up in those years, the 1920s, 1930s, into the 1940s. Mountain was something they heard about in whispers. It was spoken of in ceremony sometimes, though often with a careful silence. Their grandparents had fasted on those slopes. Their great-grandparents had ridden across those valleys before fences, before borders, before barbed wire claimed the horizon. Now, dynamite was reshaping the highest peak, and they were told to stay away, not by their families, but by the signs, the permits, The soldiers, the invisible net of exclusion that kept native families from approaching their own sacred ground. The Black Hills, still spiritually theirs, were now legally not, so they watched from a distance. Some from schoolyards, where lessons included American presidents, but not the treaties those presidents had broken. Some from dusty agency offices, where ration lines stretched and names were mispronounced. Some from trucks, as families drove east to Rapid City for supplies, passing the carved faces as they grew each year: Washington's brow, Jefferson's chin, Roosevelt's glasses, Lincoln's solemn eyes. The children saw the monument appear in pieces. At first, it looked like a mountain being chipped at. Then it became something else, a face, then another. The way the clouds passed behind them made them seem alive for a moment, like they were watching. But who were they watching? The Lakota. None of the children in those cars or fields or homes ever imagined that someone like them would one day be carved into stone. They knew, even as children, that history was something told about them, not with them. Still, their elders taught them the names of the peaks, the old names: Tu, Kam Ila, Okpi, the six grandfathers, the spiritual beings that represented the cardinal directions: the earth, the sky, and the self. These had once been the mountains, true faces, formless, but ever present. And now, the granite bore the features of men, would never walk the ridges they now occupied. Some of the children asked their parents why those men, and their parents didn't always answer with names. They answered with stories of winter camps, of buffalo trails, of fasting rituals that lasted for days and 4 nights, a time when people could climb that mountain and not be told to leave, of treaties signed and then shredded, ceremonies banned, then punished, of land promised as long as the grass shall grow, and then taken before the grass had a chance. For many Lakota families, the monument became a paradox. It brought jobs to the region: stone workers, tool suppliers, transport workers. A few tribal members even worked on the mountain, mostly in uncredited roles. It brought roads, money, eyes from the rest of the country, but it also brought silence, the kind that settles when your stories are not asked for, when your elders' names are left out of plaques, when your hills are referred to as empty before the monument filled them. Some families held naming ceremonies in secret. Others began driving deeper into the Black Hills to find quiet groves where they could still pray, still lay down tobacco, still speak the words that had always been said. But even these places became harder to find. One Lakota grandmother, born near the turn of the century, once said, "We don't point at the mountain because we fear it, but because it already points back at us." She had seen the mountain before the carving. She had gone there once as a young girl, walking with her grandfather. He had brought her to the ridge where the wind meets the cliff, where the stars seemed to sit lower in the sky. They sat together and said nothing. He burned a sprig of sweetgrass and tied a red cloth to a branch. Then they walked down. She never saw the mountain like that again. When the carving began, she did not return. Not because she couldn't, but because the silence had changed. What had once been stillness became noise. Not just volume, it was violation, an uninvited presence. Her grandchildren would grow up knowing Mount Rushmore only as a monument, a given, a backdrop in textbooks and vacation brochures. They would not learn in school that their own family had once walked there barefoot, that the ridge had a name before it was renamed, that the treaties were still in effect, at least in spirit, if not in law. They would have to learn that elsewhere, in kitchens, around fire pits, in the quiet spaces between questions, because, the mountain could no longer be reclaimed in granite, the memory of it still could. And so the children listened to stories that were not written in books, to songs that had no recordings, to grief that wasn't loud, to pride that did not need permission. And they grew up not looking away from the monument, but through it. Asterisk, the children born during the years of the carving between the late 1920s and early 1940s did not grow up in the shadow of Mount Rushmore. They grew up in its wake, on reservations, in government-built housing, in boarding schools where their hair was cut and their language forbidden. And somewhere in the background of their lives, always, was the mountain. It appeared on postcards, on coins, on classroom walls, but it was never for them. They were taught to salute the faces carved into it, to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, to name the presidents who looked out from the granite. But no one taught them the old stories of the 6 grandfathers. Not in school, not in books. Those stories had to survive in whispers, and yet they did. In some families, grandmothers continued to speak Lakota to the youngest, even as they switched to English for the officials. And others, fathers, refused to tell their children to be proud of the monument, but didn't say why. They simply told them to remember what the land was before the blasts, before the scaffolding, before the tourists. It was a different kind of education, one based not in curriculum, but in memory. Asterisk, these children carried that memory like a secret. They lived with both maps, the one taught in school and the one taught at home. They knew how to find Rushmore on a highway and how to find their own stories in the hills behind it. The two realities didn't blend. They collided quietly. Many of these children grew up hearing their elders say, "Don't forget." One day they will ask, but for much of the 20th century, no one asked as Mount Rushmore became a national symbol. The Lakota were often portrayed as part of the past, historical, vanished background to the monument. Tourists were told the Black Hills were once inhabited by Indians, as if the Lakota no longer lived just miles away. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was part of the monument's success. Asterisk, Rushmore didn't just carve for presidents into stone, it carved away the people whose presence would complicate the story. The monument was clean, triumphant. It didn't speak of broken treaties or stolen land. It didn't have to door. It could afford to be silent because its silence was protected. But the children of the land were not silent. Some of them became elders in their own right, carrying forward the quiet resistance of their parents. Others became activists, lawyers, teachers. Some organized protests. Some sat on tribal councils. Some worked in the court systems that had once refused to hear their grandparents. All of them knew where the mountain stood, and all of them knew what had been buried beneath it. Asterisks. There was a man named Henry who, as a child, rode in the back of his family's wagon past the carving site. I remember looking up and seeing just George Washington's nose, partly shaped. His father didn't say anything, just spat tobacco out the side of his mouth and kept riding. It wasn't until years later that Henry understood the silence. Another child, Lila, remembered sitting beside her aunt on a cold morning, watching smoke rise from the hills where the monument stood. Her aunt said, "They're not looking at us. They're looking at something else." Lila asked, "What are they looking at?" And her aunt said, "They're looking at the idea of themselves." That line stayed with her long after she left boarding school, long after she left the reservation to become a nurse, long after she returned to the Black Hills with her own daughter. The children who had once watched the monument rise became the keepers of the untold version of its story. Not in defiance, but in balance. They didn't need to tear it down. They needed to name what it left out. In recent years, some of them began guiding youth back to the old trails, not just to resist the monument, but to restore the relationship with the land it had tried to overwrite. They brought tobacco, small offerings wrapped in cloth. They pointed out where old trails used to pass before they were replaced with scenic turnouts. They showed children the streams that still ran clear, even after the dust of the carving had long settled. And they told them, the mountain is not just what they made it. It is still what it was. Because land, unlike stone, has layers. You can carve a face into it. You can name it after a lawyer. You can build a parking lot at its base and sell souvenir t-shirts in its shadow. But the roots remember. The ridges remember. The ancestors remember. And so do the children. Even now, children, many of them elders, today return not to mourn, but to teach. To walk along tree lines and point to places that once held medicine. To speak the names of peaks that were never carved. To say prayers, not for revenge, but for memory. They do not do this with anger. They do it with patience, because they know the mountain can hold more than one story, and they are still telling theirs. Asterisk. By the time the carved faces on Mount Rushmore had hardened into national memory, the children who had once watched them appear were no longer children. Teachers, medicine carriers, veterans, storytellers. And they carried something different than resentment. They carried remembrance, not of the monument itself, though they knew it well, but of everything it tried to sit on top of. They remembered the hills before the noise, before the faces, before the trails were turned into access roads and the sacred groves became picnic areas. They remembered what their grandparents had told them, that the mountain had a spirit long before it had a name. Many of them had lived two lives, one told in classrooms and one told in kitchens, one that spoke of presidents and freedom, and one that spoke of treaties and silence. They had learned to translate, to survive between the official story and the real one, and now it was their turn to teach. Some did so with their presence. They walked the forests near Rushmore without apology. They taught their children the Lakota names for plants and peaks. They spoke softly to the trees. Others organized cultural camps in the hills, week-long gatherings where youth learned to pitch tippets, cook traditional meals, speak the old language. One elder, Mary, 2 Eagles, would bring her grandchildren each summer to a shaded slope a few miles from the monument. She would sit them in a circle and begin not with a speech, but with silence. "We listen first," she'd say, "then we speak." She would point toward the monument and ask, "What do you hear from it?" Most said, "Nothing." And she would nod. That's what they wanted. Then she'd point behind them to the wind moving through tall grass. "But the hills," she'd whisper, "they still speak." Her lessons were not about facts. They were about rhythm, about recognizing what had been covered but not erased, about learning to sit with contradiction, pride in survival, pain in memory, peace in knowing that the land had not forgotten them. Meanwhile, the monument continued to draw visitors, over 2 million each year, families, school groups, veterans, politicians. Few asked where the land had come from. Fewer still knew that just miles away, communities still lived with the consequences of that theft: poverty, health disparities, underfunded schools. But Lakota children still grew up with knowledge that the brochures didn't include. They knew why their families wouldn't visit Rushmore, or why, if they did, they remained quiet. They knew the land beneath the visitor center once held prayer stones. They knew that before the gift shop there had been offerings. And yet, the story was not static. Some families began reclaiming space. In the 1970s, Lakota activists occupied parts of the Black Hills, asserting treaty rights and sovereignty. In the decades that followed, others filed legal briefs, held ceremonies, wrote songs, taught classes. One young man, Thomas Red Cloud, the great-great-grandson of the Oglala leader, Red Cloud, became a park ranger at a nearby site. He wore the uniform not to blend in, but to speak truth from within. Each time he addressed a group of visitors, he told them both stories, the carved one and the buried one. He would end each tour with the question, "What does it mean to honor history if we don't honor the people whose land it stands on?" Some were uncomfortable. Others asked more. A few nodded in silence, but the story was beginning to shift. In recent years, there have been calls to add a fifth face to the monument of fans suggested are figures like Susan B. Anthony or Martin Luther King Jr. But for the Lakota, the deeper question remains, why must a mountain carry any face? Why not let it return to its own? The Black Hills, they say, don't need to be fixed. They need to be heard. And hearing doesn't require explosives or spotlights. It requires stillness. That's what the children of the land now teach their own children, not just about resistance, but about return. Return to the trails, to the fasting sites, to the stars above, Bear Butte, to the names whispered in ceremony. Because even if the mountain cannot be uncarved, the story around it can be unforgotten. Some believe the land still holds memory like water in stone, that it absorbs what happens to it, that the blasts still echo faintly in the roots, that the carved eyes do not watch the future, they watch the past. And yet, the mountain endures. Tourists come and go. Trees grow taller. Snow reshapes the ridges. And in that quiet rhythm of breath and change, the Black Hills remain not just as monument, but as medicine. The children of the land walk softly now, not because they are afraid, but because they remember. They remember the sound of drills, and the silence that came before them. They remember faces not the ones in granite, but the ones in memory. They remembered the land before it was named after someone else, They remembered the stories that were almost lost in, the ones that waited to be found again. And the mountain, though scarred, still listens. Asterisks before Mount Rushmore, before the presidents, before the dynamite echoed through the Black Hills. Gutzon Borglum had another mountain. It was taller, smoother, and more famous at the time, rising over Georgia like a sentinel carved by wind and myth. Its name was Stone Mountain. To most Americans today, Stone Mountain is remembered, if at all, a controversial monument in the Deep South. But long before those conversations rose into national headlines, it was the place where Gutzon Borglum first learned how to turn rock into propaganda. It was 1915. The country was changing. A new century had dawned. The Civil War was 50 years gone, but not forgotten. Across the South, a movement was growing, one that wanted to immortalize the Confederacy, not as a memory, but as a moral legacy. That year, a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy approached Borglum. They had a dream, a colossal relief carving of Confederate heroes etched into the face of Stone Mountain near Atlanta. They wanted Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, three generals immortalized as gods of a lost cause. Borglum said yes. It was the biggest commission of his life at the time, and he threw himself into it with fury and ambition. He envisioned not just a simple carving, but an entire tableau. Dozens of horsemen, flags waving in stone, battle cries frozen in time, Confederate Mount Olympus. He began building models, drawing sketches, raising funds, and aligning himself quietly, then publicly, with the organizations that could make it happen. One of those was the Ku Klux Klan. It was no accident, which had been mostly dormant since Reconstruction, was experiencing a violent rebirth. In November 1915, just as Borglum was beginning his work, the Klan held a cross-burning ceremony at the summit of Stone Mountain. They weren't hiding. They believed the mountain and Borglum's carving would be their temple, and Borglum, while never an official member, did not object. In fact, he collaborated with Klan leaders, attended their fundraisers, and praised them in private correspondence. He once wrote that the Klan was a growing, useful movement, and referred to Stone Mountain as a monument to the Anglo-Saxon spirit. For him, the art and the ideology were intertwined. He didn't just want to carve men, he wanted to carve meaning. And the meaning, in his eyes, was racial pride. Unity through supremacy. A narrative that honored the past by reinscribing it into the land itself. He worked feverishly. In 1923, the head of Robert E. Lee was unveiled in a public ceremony attended by thousands. Speeches were given. Flags were waved. The Klan marched, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The Stone Mountain Memorial Association, the body overseeing the project, grew uneasy with Borglum's demands. He wanted full control. He wanted more money. He wanted more space. He refused to compromise. By 1925, the relationship had soured. Arguments erupted over design choices and timelines. Accusations flew of mismanagement, ego, financial recklessness, and then the unthinkable. In February 1925, the board fired Borglum. He didn't go quietly. In a fury, he stormed into his workshop, destroyed his plaster models with an axe, and fled Georgia. He would never return to Stone Mountain. The carving he left behind, a portion of Lee's head, was later blasted off the rock face to make room for a new sculptor. The work was eventually completed decades later, in 1972, by other hands. Today, Stone Mountain holds the largest bas-relief sculpture in the world, but none of it belongs to Borglum. His vision was removed, his name barely mentioned, and yet he never forgot. He once wrote that leaving Stone Mountain was like ripping out his heart. But hearts, like mountains, remember what's been done to them. After fleeing Stone Mountain in 1925, Gutzon Borglum left behind more than an unfinished sculpture. He left behind a battlefield, not just of art and politics, but of reputation. In the South, he was seen by some as a traitor, by others as a genius unappreciated. He had destroyed his own models in rage, cut ties with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and alienated his most powerful backers. Even the Ku Klux Klan, whose fundraising and influence had helped birth the project, turned their back on him. But Borglum wasn't done. Not even close. He needed a new mountain, a new vision, a new opportunity to reshape not just stone, but history. And that opportunity came in the form of a letter. It was from Don Robinson, a South Dakota historian who believed that his state could draw more tourists if it had something monumental, something no one could ignore. Robinson imagined statues of local heroes carved into the Black Hills. Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill, Cody, and perhaps even Red Cloud. Borglum had other ideas. He replied with enthusiasm, but made it clear that regional figures were not enough. If they were going to carve into a mountain, it had to be national. It had to tell the story of America. And the way to do that, he said, was through presidents. Not just any presidents, but for men who, in his mind, embodied America's birth, growth, preservation, and development. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt. In 1927, funding was approved, and the project began. But Borglum hadn't changed. His ambition remained towering, his politics complex and troubling. Though he had been exiled from the South, his views on race and power had not softened. He still believed in national destiny, still believed that great men should be carved into stone, not to be remembered, but to be revered. And so he arrived in the Black Hills land that had been sacred to the Lakota for generations, land that had been guaranteed to them by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, land that had been taken illegally after the gold rush of the 1870s. Looked up at Mount Rushmore to the Lakota. It was Tukaela-OGP, the six grandfathers. To Borglum, it was a blank slate. He did not ask what the land meant to the people who still lived nearby. He did not acknowledge the treaties or the spiritual weight of the granite. He simply saw space. He chose Mount Rushmore for its southeastern exposure, meaning it would catch the morning light. He liked the quality of the granite he saw in it. what he had seen in Stone Mountain, a place to inscribe greatness. But here, like in Georgia, Borglum had total control. He shaped not only the art, but the story around it. There would be no Confederate flags this time, no white hoods in the background. This was to be a shrine to democracy, a monument to unity. But underneath the speeches and scaffolding, the threads of his past remained. Borglum still used the language of destiny, still saw history as a triumph of certain men of vision, men of power, men who, like him, shaped the world by force of will. In choosing the 4 presidents, he chose not only leadership, but conquest. Washington, who fought for independence on land already lived in. Jefferson, who imagined westward expansion at the expense of indigenous nations. Lincoln, who preserved the Union while ordering the largest mass execution in U.S. history, the hanging of 38 Dakota men in 1862. Roosevelt, who said openly that Native Americans were savages who had to make way for progress, and now their faces would rise from the heart of the Lakota's most sacred land. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Borglum once said, "A nation's memorial is a mirror of its people." But he never asked whose reflection was missing. Still, he poured himself into the work. The same energy, the same showmanship, the same perfectionism that had driven him to ruin in Georgia now made him a legend in South Dakota. He became a local hero. Presidents visited the site. Journalists wrote profiles. Photographers captured his dramatic poses against the mountain. Wind in his coat, pointing toward the sky. But no one asked about Stone Mountain. No one asked about the models he had smashed with an axe, or the Klan meetings he had once attended, or the way he had learned to make granite political to the nation. Borglum was reborn, a patriot, a sculptor, a visionary, but to some, especially those whose land he now chiseled, he was just another face of the same story. A man who carved myths where truths had once lived, who blasted the spirit out of stone, who brought the tools of his past ideological and physical land, used them to build a monument meant to last 10,000 years, and maybe it will. But even now, if you stand in the forest near Mount Rushmore far enough that the faces disappear, you might hear something in the wind. Not a voice, not a memory, a question. What does it mean to build a monument? It's meant to last longer than the people it erased. Asterisk, in 1941, when Gutzon Borglum died suddenly of complications following surgery, the mountain was not finished. He had spent the last 14 years of his life carving his second monument into sacred Lakota land. His ashes were not buried at Mount Rushmore. He was laid to rest in California, but his name would forever be fused to the granite faces he left behind. To most Americans, Borglum was remembered as a patriot, a sculptor of vision, a man who turned rock into narrative. But what happens when the narrative is incomplete? When the sculptor's past is erased as thoroughly as the ridges he blasted from the mountain? At Stone Mountain, Borglum's first monument was eventually completed by others, years later in a different style, with a different vision. But even today, the park surrounding it is steeped in controversy. The carvings of Confederate leaders remain, but now exist under the shadow of a nation increasingly unwilling to celebrate what they stood for. And Borglum's name is barely mentioned there at Mount Rushmore. However, he dominates the lore. His face appears in old newsreels. His notes are displayed in museum cases. His ambition is celebrated. And his personal flaws politely brushed aside if they're mentioned at all. Visitors learn about the techniques he used, the tools, the scaling models, the fact that no workers died during the project. They marvel at his determination, but they are rarely told about the man who once carved Confederate generals, who wrote letters praising the Klan, who saw in stone a means of declaring which stories mattered and which ones did not, because it's not mountains that get carved into shapes. It's memory, and memory like granite, can't be chiseled to fit the design of the moment. Borglum did not invent the idea of erasure, but he practiced it with precision. In Georgia, he carved into the past to revive it. In South Dakota, he carved over the present to obscure it. In both cases, the land bore the burden. And yet, land remembers differently than people do. Stone does not erase. It holds scars. It weathers slowly. It reveals layers. And so, long after the last hammer was dropped, the mountain still whispers. Not just with the faces it shows, but with the silence it keeps. Many Lakota descendants today walk past Rushmore without stopping. Some close their eyes when they drive past. Others refuse to visit, not out of hatred, out of respect for what used to be there, for what still is there beneath the surface. Because no matter how deeply you carve, some things remain. And what remained after Borglum left was more than just faces. It was a lesson that monuments are not just about honoring the past, decaying how we feel about it, and sometimes about forgetting who paid the price for that feeling. Today, some historians have begun to include the fuller story of Guts and Borglum in exhibitions and books. Not to cancel him, not to condemn, but to complete the story, to show that even those who shape memory leave behind their own shadows. And maybe that's what the mountain still teaches, that greatness and harm are not mutually exclusive, that art and politics are not separate. Dabbed, history is not neutral, it's sculpted. So the next time someone stands beneath the gaze of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, it is worth asking not just what they see, but who they don't. Because Borglum is the man who once dreamed of carving Confederate glory into Georgia's stone, ended up building a monument to American presidents on land taken from the Lakota. And history did not stop him. It helped him. It paid him. It called him visionary. But the land never did. It simply endured, still scarred, still sacred, still waiting. Asterisk.